3, 2, 1. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges and fellow debaters. As we all know, we all today here stand to discuss the mention that developed countries have a moral obligation to accept more climate refugees. I'm Domitila Perone, the first speaker of the proposition team that is also composed by Flavia Ciappi, the second speaker, and Caterina Pulici, the third speaker. As we all know, we all live in a world where the effects of climate change are no longer prediction. They are the reality, they are our life. A study done by the International Space and Monitoring Center has shown that over 376 million people have been displaced due to natural disaster. Before moving forward, I would like to clarify a little of the future, a little of these terms. First of all, a developed country is a country with a mature and sophisticated economy, usually measured by the GDP. Developed countries have advanced technological infrastructure and have diverse industrial and service sectors. Their citizens typically enjoy access to quality healthcare and higher education. More often than not, this long-standing economy was based on the emission of carbon dioxide in the last century and a half. Then I would like to clarify the term climate refugee. A climate refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their home due to climate disasters such as flooding, heat waves, and such. And then to end it, a moral obligation refers to a duty that is not bound up by law or history or such as, but just to the conscience of a people to do what's right for the world. So in this case, it's the moral conscience correlated to taking responsibility for what has been done in the last half and in the last century. First of all, we are going to present three main points. I'm going to talk about possible words and the effect that these policies could have, and then I'm going to talk about the historical responsibility, and then my second speaker, Flavia Mosè, will talk about the possibility and capabilities of developed countries. First of all, I would like to present you a world without action. A world where developed countries do not take up to their errors that have been made in the past. Let's imagine a world where people have to flee their homes to leave everything they had behind due to climate disaster and try to go to better countries where they are not accepted. In this country, the countries affected by climate disaster are not able to properly help their citizens due to the fact that they're trying to rebuild their infrastructure, and so they try to do something, but they do not have enough funds. In this world, developed countries do not try to help citizens and instead turn away. Then I would like you to think about a world where developed countries take up to their responsibility. A world where borders are not limits or something bad. A world where borders are a safe word for people that have left all they had behind.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
So developed countries have been hosting climate refugees for the last decades. So the second word that you're describing is the status quo. Are you aware of it?
I'm aware of it, but we declare that developed countries need to do more of this due to the moral obligation of what they've done in the last centuries. And so I was talking about the fact that borders should be turned into safe port for people to go there and try to gain a better life. And this has been happening, as I stated before, in countries like Germany, Canada, and even Australia that open legal pathways. Then I would like to talk about the responsibilities of the emission and climate change. As we all know, in the last 150 years, so more or less till the Industrial Revolution, between 75 and 80% of emission has been produced by what is called the Great North, composed by the majority of the developed countries. On the other side, just less than 100% of emission have been made at those that we could call less developed countries that are suffering the most for it. Let's take for account Pakistan. So Pakistan accounts for less than 1% of those aforementioned emissions, and yet it has suffered the devastating effects. In 2022, there were catastrophic monsoon floods that displaced more than 30 million people, that killed more than 1,700 people. And this problem they weren't the only problem. In this year, Pakistan was also suffering from deadly earthquakes that put strain on the crops and the water resources. And Pakistan's adaptive capacity is limited to their inadequate infrastructure, healthcare, and governance. There's also the ND Game ranking that ranks Pakistan among the most vulnerable and least prepared countries globally. As I stated before, this coincidence between climate problem and responsibility, it was not accidental, it was historical. And justice demands that those who have done the most should do the most to repair to this problem. The European Parliament briefing, yeah, for sure.
Would you say that the most polluting countries right now are developed countries?
Oh, the most polluting countries right now are also some of the most developed countries, even if you acknowledge the fact that maybe some of the countries that are polluting the most are also less developed countries. But we are assessing the fact that developed countries should have, and that they need to help more of them, more of the climate refugees trying to escape from a fatal future. So, with up to 200 million expected to be displaced by 2050 related to climate disaster, the moral scale is impossible to ignore. We need to know the fact that even if the past has already happened and it's impossible to ignore, but we can change our future. Some may argue that a moral obligation is not a law, but I would like to pose an example for you. Let's take into account the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 that is outlined the 30 rights and freedoms that belong to all of us and that all of us should have, that take on account health and health lifestyle, and this declaration is an obligation, is a moral obligation due to the universal recognition and its status as a foundation for international human rights. In fact, decades after it was adopted, the international community has taken up a variety of international binding legal documents on the right of this declaration. Let's take for account the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that protects, among other things, the right to education and healthcare. So today, as the proposition team, we stand before you to ask you a question. Us, as developed countries, have a moral obligation to accept more climate refugees so that it could become a law, so that we could help more and more people who are trying to escape from a fatal future and help them to have a better future. With this, I'm done with my speech. I must thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Your speech lasted 7 minutes. Okay, if you're ready to start.
Everyone ready?
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, judges. Today, a self-opposition first speaker, you can expect 4 main things for my speech. First, I'm going to do some rebuttals on what your team said, then I'm going to do some clarification on framework, and then I'm going to present to you our first 2 substantives. Let's start with the rebuttals. So, they said that developed countries do not take up for their past actions. And furthermore, they have said that developed countries have the means to host climate refugees. And that's what we're trying to say, that developed countries have the means to host climate refugees, and nowadays they are taking up for their actions. In fact, they are hosting climate refugees. And what proposition fails to tell us and to explain us is why do we need more climate refugees? Because today developed countries are already taking up for their actions, for their past errors. Then I'm going to explain to you later why we don't need more climate refugees on my second argumentation. Then let's move on to our team line. So our first substantive will be the acceptance of more climate refugees is morally unjustified. Then the second is about the impacts on climate refugees, and the third one is about the motion impacts on local economy. So let's begin by redefining what morality is, because we believe that morality is the center of this debate. We stick with the shared definition of moral being concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior. For example, if I steal your pen and break it, we believe that it's right and therefore moral that I buy you a new pen. However, if someone else breaks it, I don't have a moral obligation to give you a new one, even if I may have used your pen on another occasion too. Therefore, moral obligation is linked to actions, and we cannot be held responsible for the consequences of actions committed by others. Now, let's apply the same logic to the far bigger scenario of this motion. In order for side proposition to win this debate, they have to do two main things. First, they have to prove that the causes of climate refugees fleeing their country are developed countries. And second, they have to prove that by hosting them, developed countries will improve living conditions of climate refugees, therefore fulfilling the responsibility. On the first one, our first sum. The acceptance of more climate refugees is morally unjustified. So, developed countries cannot be held accountable for the disruption of the environment. Because when we look at the most polluting countries in the world, we find China, United States, India, Russia, Iran, and Indonesia. So, of these 6, only one country is a developed country. And China and India alone pollute more than the EU, that is composed by 27 countries. So, furthermore, the emissions by the US and the EU are going down, while developing countries, like China, India, Mexico, Vietnam, or Brazil, are going up. These countries are expected to pollute even more. So, we can see 3 things. A, developed countries are not the most polluting ones. B, they are, however, the only ones that are lowering their emissions. And C, they also are the only ones respecting and imposing international law that safeguards climate regulations. Because let's think of how the EU imposes this regulation with the Mercosur free trade deal. It refuses to buy products that contribute to deforestation and don't follow the guidelines. So they're actively improving the situations, whereas China pushes for deforestation because, of course, it costs less. So we tell you that insofar as the motion talks about developed countries, and the only developed country that we believe is still part of the problem is America, developed countries do not have a moral obligation to host more climate refugees. And we also tell you that they have the responsibility to solve the issues they caused in the past. And they're doing it in so many ways. A few examples, international treaties and agreements like the Green New Deal that lowers emissions globally. And also the continuous investments in developing nations with humanitarian aid. But then, mind you that this motion talks about more people. So this implies that developed countries, as I was saying before, already accept more climate refugees. And we also have a few data to support this idea directly from the European Union Migration Center that talks about millions of people being displaced into the 27 European countries, but the US has hosted just as many from the Center and South America. Also, Australia has signed a deal to host a smaller community that smaller community that is badly affected by climate change. And it is obvious that developed nations have been changing the system for the last few decades and have already responded to their previous responsibility, so fulfilled their moral duty towards climate refugees. However, insofar, they are not the cause of today's problem for climate refugees. And so they cannot be held responsible, and therefore do not have a moral responsibility. So the round could finish here, because the motion specifically talks about morality. But let's analyze it from a practical point of view as well. And that brings us to our second substantive on impacts on climate refugees. So, hosting climate refugees in developed countries traps them in cycles of exploitation while reducing incentives to address the root causes of climate displacement. Because when developed countries accept climate refugees, these individuals are often pushed into low status and underpaid jobs that the local population no longer wants to do. So what happens is that... Yes?
Isn't exploitation against human rights itself?
Yes, it is, but developed countries will still do with more climate refugees. So the problem with climate refugees is that they have limited language skills and legal protection, and that brings them to be exploited by companies when it comes to jobs like agriculture or construction. And we can prove this trend with evidence from different countries. For example, in Italy or in France, where farm workers are paid 50 cents for every box of fruit they collect, and they are paid illegally, and with this money, they also have to pay taxes. So, on the comparative, we will be investing in large-scale climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. The EU, which is leading organization for climate reparation globally, has been leading the way, sending humanitarian help in those countries. And the reality is that hosting is not a sufficient solution, because we need to offer displaced people the chance to return home, and unless we actually invest in environmental transition, there will be no difference. Then, second layer on why climate change is less likely to be solved on-site proposition. Because hosting refugees can allow states to claim moral credit without taking substantive. And this looks like Germany hosting 20,000 refugees from Bangladesh. In this case, Germany thinks that they don't have to take further action on climate change because they're already hosting 20,000 people. Then, some impacts. So, if refugees are trapped in the system, then there will be no benefits for them. So, global inaction on climate change would be prolonged. So, environmental degradation would be worsened. And so, by that, the number of future climate refugees will be increased. So, we will be in a loop. And also doing some weighing that in the short term, we would have only negative impacts on climate refugees, while in the long term, individuals will be exploited now and in the future. So, generation will face even greater threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your speech lasted 8 minutes 5 seconds.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, honorable judges, esteemed members of the opposition. Before I present my constructive case, I would like to address and rebuttal some of the things that have been said by the opposition. So, first of all, they talked about how this motion is talking about morality, and that is a very important point, which I'm also going to talk about, because the developed countries are the ones who have caused the climate crisis, and that is why they have a moral obligations to help and to act. And so I'm going to talk about this in one of the points that I presented today. Then they also talked about how climate refugees are often exploited by developed countries, and they are doing underpaid jobs. And that may be true, but it's not always the case. Sometimes there are many countries that have made integration programs to help climate refugees, and also the fact that they come to a developed country and maybe do jobs that the people who live in the country maybe wouldn't want to do is a positive aspect, because it prevents from having some tensions about climate refugees stealing the job of the people who live. No, thank you. So this could prevent some tensions, and that is a very important aspect. And now I'm going to move into my case, and I'm going to focus on 3 central ideas. The first one is that developed countries have the capacity, the means, and the moral responsibility to help. Then I'm going to talk about how there are already existing systems and policies that show how this can be done successfully. And then I'm going to talk about the positive outcomes that accepting climate refugees has brought to many countries. So I'm going to start with the capacity and their responsibility. So developed countries are not, like I said, developed countries are not only the most equipped countries to help, but they are the ones that cause the climate problems. And this can, no, thank you. This is proven by many examples. For example, in countries in the global north, especially like the US, Canada, and much of Europe, and also Australia. These countries are responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions, and the top 10 emitting countries account for nearly 70% of global carbon emissions. And according to Oxfam, the richest 1% of global population emit more than twice as much carbon as the poorest 50%. And meanwhile, who are the people that suffer the consequences? There are nations like Tuvalu and also Kiribati that are already planning full-scale evacuations due to rising sea levels. Droughts and floods are displacing millions in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. And these communities contributed almost nothing to the problem, and yet they are being pushed out of their homes and often permanently.
POI.
So this is not about charity, it's about justice, because developed countries are not just bystanders, they are complicit, and that comes with the duty to act. And let's be clear, they have the means to help because they have strong economies, they have social infrastructure, and they have political stability. For example, countries like Canada, Germany, France, and also Japan have job markets with labor shortages, so they could help in many ways. Now I'm going to talk about the second point, which is that there are already many existing programs and systems that already work. For example, Australia, in 2023, Australia signed a historic treaty with Tuvalu, offering 280 annual residency spots for Tuvaluans facing existential threat from rising seas. And Australia is also helping to fund adaptation projects on the island itself. And this dual approach, focusing on both the resettlement and also the adaptation, is a responsible and balanced model of a project that can work. We can also talk about Canada's private sponsorship of refugees program, which has been running since 1979. And it's a very important program because there are more than 300,000 people that have been resettled through this program. And in 2021, Canada welcomed more refugees than any other country. And the system is very transparent, and it helped a lot to empower the civil society. Another example is Germany. Between 2015 and 2016, Germany accepted over 1 million refugees, mostly from Syria. And this was a very, very hard challenge, but they managed to do that. And also, they managed to have many integration programs. So these integration programs helped with language training, education, and also job access. And today, the majority of those refugees who have been welcomed in Germany are either working or studying. And so this country not only managed to help these climate refugees, but the country also benefited from helping them and hosting them in their country. This brings me to my last point, which is the mutual benefits. Because when done right, accepting climate refugees can bring many benefits. Let's talk about economics. In the US, refugee-owned businesses generate over 4.6 billion in income annually. And in Canada, refugees always start small businesses at higher rates than native-born citizens. And in Germany, many Syrian refugees have filled labor gaps and helped sustain economic growth. Also in a country with one of the oldest populations in the world. also there are diplomatic and humanitarian gains. By stepping up and welcoming climate refugees, developed countries built soft power and demonstrated global leadership. And they created partnerships and goodwill with the vulnerable nations. And that is another very important aspect. So in conclusion, this motion is really about the people who need help as soon as possible, and that need to be that need to be hosted in developed countries because they do not have a home, and so developed countries have both the responsibility and the means and the opportunity to help and to respond. And accepting more climate refugees is not just an act of charity, but is a very smart way to also empower the economy. This is the end of my speech.
Thank you very much. Your speech lasted 8 minutes and 31 seconds.
As second speaker from side proposition, you can expect 3 main things from my speech. First of all, the main clashes in this round and rebuttals, and show you why side opposition is currently and should currently win this debate. And then I'll move on to our third argument, and finally I'll do some weighing and show you why the arguments that we brought on the table were more relevant and important than the argument that side position brought. But let's start with the rebuttals, right? The first clash that I'd like to analyze is on responsibility. So what does proposition tell us? They tell us that developed countries have historical responsibilities. Let's break down the chain of mechanization so that we can understand properly why this is actually a fallacy. The first step is that you have historic responsibility because you have done something wrong in the past. The second step is that you fulfill your obligation because you act in order to repair what you've done wrongly in the past. The third and last step is that you're freed from your responsibility. Now, the same logic is applied to the motion at hand. We tell you, have developed nation, fulfilled their historic responsibility? The answer is yes. How have they done so? By hosting climate refugees, by sending them loans, by investing in their countries, by building refugee centers in the neighboring countries, by hosting them, by protecting them in Kiribati. The examples they bring on, we can flip them and show you how developed nations have been acting right now. And most importantly, the most important step that developed nations have done is they've been acting on climate change. Decades ago, they understood in the 70s that climate change was a problem and they started lowering their emissions. Their emissions went down. Right now, India, we told you, pollutes just as much as even more actually than all of the 27 countries that make up the EU combined. We then show you that developed countries cannot be held responsible for something they did 200 years ago and for something that they've already repaired because other countries are now worsening and exacerbating the problem. So when it comes to historic responsibility, we have shown to you that they have already fulfilled their responsibility and they cannot be held accountable for the actions of other countries. This point flows on our side. On the second point of responsibility then, what does proposition tell us? They tell us that the countries have the resources and therefore they should do it from a moral standpoint. How do we respond? How do we respond? We tell you that developed countries do so much to help. They're already fulfilling even that other obligation, which is, I have the resources to do it, I should do it. They're already doing it, right? How? By investing in these countries. But side proposition needs to do a specific thing. They need to prove why the moral obligation is towards hosting, one second I will take it, is towards hosting specifically. The only response and mechanization we get from that is that they have to host them because they have an historic responsibility. But insofar as I've already proven that the historic responsibility has already been fulfilled, they don't really show us why developed countries specifically need to host them. We tell you that they have the resources, but they can choose how to invest these resources. They are able to protect them and not hurt themselves. We show you, and we will show you through our third arc, that if they were to host even more climate refugees, their economies, and specifically their local economies, would be hurt, and the situation for climate refugees would become even worse. Therefore, we tell you that even in this case, when it comes to responsibility, they do not have a moral obligation towards hosting them specifically. But before we move on, I will take a point.
Are you aware that developed countries benefited from the pollution produced in India, especially by the factories that have been moved there in less century?
Yes, we are very much aware of that, and that perfectly leads us to our third point, which is on practical outcomes. When it comes to talking only about moral obligations, we have already told you why they've been fulfilled. But let's analyze the practical outcomes. Two stakeholders on this. The refugees, first of all. As side proposition has just stated in a POI, developed nations exploit developing nations and get benefits by keeping them trapped in cycles of exploitation. So what happens is that these climate refugees seek help, and then they come here in Italy, and then they go to France, and then they go to Germany, and then they go to all of the countries that we gave you the examples of, and get trapped in cycles of exploitation. And they get paid 50 cents for every market of fruit that they're able to sell. And then they need to pay those taxes. They brought us this argument in the last minute about the economy, right? Saying how developed nations benefited economically because they were able to raise and increase their GDP. Of course they were able to increase their GDP. They're literally exploiting these people, paying them pennies, giving them nothing, giving them low wages, starving them to death, and at the same time benefiting. Why is this relevant? Because we tell you that one of the burdens of side proposition is to proving that they're actually improving the situation of climate refugees by hosting them. They are not able to do so because they are actually trapping them in those cycles. Why do we make it better? Because when we don't host them, we cannot say that we've already done our share. And therefore, we're obliged, because of political and social pressure, to invest in those countries. Therefore, we send humanitarian help and humanitarian aid to their countries. Therefore, we do what we're supposed to do to actually provide help. We give them the possibility to fight back climate change. Whereas on side proposition, they have no incentives whatsoever to continue seeking solutions to climate change. We told you the scenario, right? It's like Germany saying, I'm already hosting 100,000 climate refugees. Why should I keep investing my money in climate research? I'm already doing my part. But then what does that lead to? What is the impact? The impact is that then you're not finding solutions for climate change. But if you don't find solutions for climate change, you have more climate refugees coming in. And if you have more climate refugees coming in, then more people are trapped in this cycle. Side proposition not only has to prove that there's a moral obligation, but they have to prove that they're able to improve the situation. They have not done this so far. And so the practical outcomes flow on our side. Finally, let's move on to the practical outcomes for the local economies, our third and last argument. When a country gives shelter to refugees, there are several costs that need to be taken into account. The first one, the cost of humanitarian aid, right? Because when a climate-related disaster strikes, affected communities require immediate essentials such as food, clean water, shelter, etc. The second one, when climate refugees seek refuge, their hosting communities must provide essential services such as education, healthcare. So then there are two possible scenarios that arise. The first one, and the most probable one, is that developed countries will not provide them with healthcare and education. And that is the scenario that we provided you in our second argument, and is the one where climate refugees end up in those cycles of exploitment. The second one, which is side proposition's best case, in which we're being extremely charitable, is that where side refugees are welcomed and educated and therefore access a better life. But the thing is that we cannot ignore the consequences that this bears on local communities. Because these people are welcomed and hosted in rural communities. These people are also willing to accept low wages. Why is that? Because they come from a really difficult situation, right? So they're willing to accept the smallest amount of money in order to at least have something. But then there are two problems that arise. The first one is on loss of jobs. Most climate refugees are hosted illegally. They take away jobs from local communities because they don't have contracts. And then the second problem is related to demand and supply. Immigrants accept lower wages, Consequently, the wage pattern goes down by the principle of demand and supply, and then the people of the rural communities that are already struggling in developed nations now have to face less jobs and lower wages. And so at the end of this round, we tell you that they don't prove moral responsibility, that they don't prove historical responsibility, and they don't prove that they're going to improve the situation for climate refugees, and they at the same time hurt local communities. We tell you that we give you a solution, which is investing in those countries directly. Vote for side opposition.
Thank you very much, Diana. Speech lasts 8 minutes.
No, okay, sorry. Okay, my speech is on 3, 2, 1. Okay, so once again, good morning, all esteemed judges and fellow debaters. Me as the first speaker of the opposition team, will start by rebuttaling some of the points that were already established during our debate, and also by explaining furthermore our team's main propositions. I would like to start with the rebuttal of the opposition team that basically cites that climate migration is very complex, and that countries should prioritize their own citizens and address domestic issues first, and the problems that come with immigration, and especially like lack of job opportunities. We would like to start by saying that in an ideal world, people wouldn't have to leave their homes. But the harsh reality is that many can't stay. Rising sea levels, drought, and extreme weather are rendering entire regions and nations inhabitable. Climate migration is not a choice, it's a necessity. Most of the people that actually migrate to the countries they're migrating for do in fact lack skill and language skills. So they have a harsher time. They have to take the least profitable jobs. But at the same time, that's the only choice they have. The other choice they have, if they cannot get located into a safer nation, is ultimately death, because that is not a safe place to live. So we offering relocation isn't just even replacing local aid; it's complementing it. We need both immediate humanitarian aid and long-term resettlement strategies. Again, another point I would like to rebuttal is that that by accepting climate refugees, we're actually condoning exploitation, which is not what we are referring to. Because when we talk about climate refugees obviously having a hard time going back and obviously being exploited by the country they are going from, they are actually having a harsher time, obviously, objectively. They are taking the harsher jobs and getting lower pays. But we, as a opposition team, we propose inclusion. We believe that by inclusion and integrating these people into our culture and our nations as developed countries, we can actually benefit the most, both from these people, to these people, and for these people. And also because but also because when we bring these people into our nations, this is not a long-term plan. The main plan is to give these people a safe location to stay while they have these climate problems. So then it's not a problem. Yeah, please.
But if they're trapped in those cycles that we described in the second argument, how are they going to be safe? They don't have food, they don't have anything.
Yeah, thank you for your question, first of all. We would like to say that these cycles are true, and obviously people are getting stuck in them, but also at the same time, while we think about the morality and the complexity that could bring, these people are actually dying, and they are actually being stranded. So climate change doesn't wait for us to think about, wait, let's fix these cycles of oppression first. Let's fix these problems that are real, but effectively they are smaller in the eyes of the actual consequences that they will have. Thank you for your time. So with that being said, I would like to summarize our team's main points. As we have stated before, and as we have begun our position statement, Climate change is no longer a future threat, but it is a present crisis. Rising seas are swallowing islands. Droughts, floods, and extreme weathers are destroying homes and livelihoods. And behind these disasters are real people, forced to flee not by choice, but by necessity. Now consider who bears the greatest responsibility. Developed nations. Developed nations, those with long-standing economic strength, achieved that prosperity through centuries of fossil fuel use and industrialization since the Industrial Revolution. That comfort and wealth they enjoy today came at a cost. Environmental damage now endangers others. That's why we have stated this is not just a political issue, but it's also a moral one. A moral obligation is not about guilt, but it's about justice. And these are not just vague ideas, they influence real-world action. As we have mentioned, they have inspired national laws and international framework, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which upholds the rights to life, security, and asylum. When nations signed this declaration, they accepted that the global responsibility matters, and climate refugees are part of that responsibility. A moral obligation means acknowledging that if your success played a part in someone else's suffering, you have a duty to help. But here's the quote-unquote good news. Developed countries are not powerless. They have the means, they have the infrastructure, and the resources to help climate refugees. And many are already doing so successfully. We have mentioned countries like Germany, Canada, and Australia, who, taking Australia for example, signed a treaty with Tuvalu. Yeah.
Insofar as hosting them may hurt their local economies, just like we explained, why should they have a specific obligation towards hosting them? Why cannot they host them in like neighboring countries?
Yeah, we have stated that since the historical fact of the climate issue plays a huge part in it, even though right now, obviously it's a matter of the past, this main problem is not about pushing individuals from the past, but it's about recognizing that developed countries still benefit from that past. So we do think that even though the historical part was where it started, they still have the moral duty today. So again, countries like Germany, Canada, and Australia have implemented structured, well-managed refugee camps that prove that this isn't just possible, but it's also beneficial. These systems provide legal pathways for displaced people, prioritize integration, and invest in inclusive planning. And to be clear, helping climate refugees is not a burden. It's most of the time a benefit. When given support, refugees bring skills, culture, and innovations, and also labor. They strengthen economies, fill workplace gaps, and enrich communities. History and research shows that inclusive resettlement can lead to long-term national gains, not just for the newcomers, but also for the host societies as well. So, as our first speaker has said, let's again imagine two worlds, two futures. In one, we turn our backs. Climate displacement continues unchecked, camps overflow, government collapse under pressure, scarcity leads to conflict, and the divide between rich and poor nations deepens, not just economically, but morally. In the other future, we step up. Developed nations act with responsibility, open doors, and build bridges. Refugees find safety and dignity. Host countries grow stronger through cooperation and shared purpose. This choice must be informed by historical responsibility. Developed countries have caused most of carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution. Meanwhile, countries like Pakistan, as we have stated, contributing less than 1%, suffered devastating climate impacts. Entire island nations that contributed almost nothing to climate change are vanishing underwater. This imbalance cannot be ignored. In conclusion, developed countries can help, have already shown that they know how to help, and should help, not just because they have the resources, but because they have the responsibility. This isn't just about policy, but it's about who we are. Let us be the first generation that shows compassion over indifference, action over excuses. Let us treat climate refugees not as strangers, but as fellow human beings, seeking only what we all deserve: safety, dignity, and a chance to rebuild. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrina. 8 minutes and 7 seconds. want.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Good evening, dear judges. As the first speaker, I would like to first rebut and then have some clarification on our framework and our argumentations, and then move on to the main clashes of this debate. So first of all, I would like to start by the responsibility and the morality that the proposition says that falls on the developed countries. So they have told us that they're responsible, historically talking, about the emissions that they have caused. Because of that, they're morally obligated to help more the developing countries regarding the environmental crisis. And they have said that also developed countries are morally obligated to help developing countries facing the environmental crisis because they have the means to help it. So once again, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the historical responsibility. Because yes, it is true that 200 years ago, 300 years ago, the developed countries have been responsible of, let's say, the emissions. But they have fulfilled totally the responsibilities, and we have come to an end. Why? Because first of all, they're already hosting the climate refugees. It's not something they're not doing. We're just talking about more refugees. Why we're saying no more refugees? Not like it's not going to be any more refugees. We're just talking like we're also giving them human aid. We're investing in their countries to actually help the environmental crisis. Let's try to get a better life for them, like also on their local communities, in their local nations and countries. And then also because we, as a developed countries, they have also lowered their emissions by modifying their industries. We have, for example, the EU not being able to work with some developing countries because they do not meet up with these actual requirements for an environmental friendly, let's say, industry. So with that, we understand that the developed countries, they have actually fulfilled their, let's say, responsibilities towards the developing countries. With that, we're not trying to say that the developed countries should not do anything more. As we have said, they are investing. Investing is the key, and later we're going to explain why. The means. So more than once, of course, the proposition has said, okay, so the developed countries have the means, and that's why they should help them. But let's talk about the means. The means and the resources are actually limited. We cannot host more refugees and invest. We should choose between the two of them. And that doesn't mean that we're going to stop getting in refugees. It's not about that. We're just saying that we prefer investing. Why we prefer investing? Because in the short term and the long term, it's going to help more. We're going to later tackle that with the clashes. And so because of that, on a national level, the developed countries, they have actually fulfilled their responsibility. Why? Because they have modified their industries, and on an international level, they send human aid, and they're hosting already refugees. About, let's say, exploitation. So we have said, as a proposition, when developing countries, refugees come from the developing countries, they face exploitation. And that's why we should invest and not get in more climate refugees. They have said, well, but exploitation is illegal. That's true. We are not here to deny it. We're just saying that it's something we are facing in a modern world, and we cannot deny that. We're just saying, and they say that there's going to be these programs about integration, and they have brought the German example. Yes, true, but what do actually consist? Like, what's the mechanization of it? What are you talking about when you're talking about integration communities and programs? You haven't tackled that. You haven't said anything about that. So, with that, we're saying that most of the time, unfortunately, the developing climate refugees face exploitation because most of the time they're illegal, their documents are not valid here, they work for this, as we have said, illegally, their degrees, even if they went to university, are not actually valid here. So once again, on all this, what's the impact on our side? It's hurting the economy. which was one of the important points here. They say, you have the means, help them, but we're telling you, yes, we have the means, but if you take more refugees in, we're gonna hurt the economy. Why do we hurt the economy? As we have said, first, it's because the wages get lower, because the refugees work illegally, and they're paid peanuts, because they aren't paid basically anything, because there's exploitation, unfortunately. And in consequence, the wages get down even for the local communities. When they say exploitation is not always the case, once again, unfortunately, most of the time it is, and the reasons why we have already explained. And yes?
Shouldn't government also work toward eliminating exploitation in our country? We are suggesting that.
No, you're suggesting to have more refugees. We have the exploitation program, the problem, and we have to face it first to enable to get actually more refugees. You're saying more refugees when we already have this kind of problem. If you take in more refugees, you're gonna have even more exploitation, so more problematics on your side. We don't want that. And then crisis. We engage with that. Environmental change is a crisis. We are not here to say it is not, because it is, and we actually recognize that. What we are saying is that our side wins on this point. Why? Because while on the proposition side, the, let's say, solution for this is taking in more climate refugees, but also investing, which we have already explained how it's not possible. We are saying that our comparative, on the short term, our works better. Why? Because the developed countries invest in the refugees centers, and they say the climate refugees to the neighboring countries. And that's because, first of all, it's more efficient. It is done in less time, as we have explained. So it is better for them because it's a crisis situation. They have said it, we all agree on that. So it takes less time. And then also, meanwhile, the EU, the developed countries, USA, everyone is trying, the developed countries, trying to help the local communities to get a better environmental impact, let's say. We save them also by putting them, let's say, in the neighboring countries. Why? Because there's no exploitation there. In a situation of exploitation in the developed countries, they're going to face that there. And also because it's not going to harm their local economies, leading to stagnation. Basically, local communities don't have jobs, refugees do not have jobs, no one has jobs, everything is basically done incorrectly, let's say. And then, lastly, we're going to talk about the clashes that we have actually already explained, but let's get into it. And the first one is about responsibility. We have explained on prop side is only his possibility responsibility and the means. On the op side, we are telling you that we have already fulfilled them, and we do not need to do more. Benefits. On their side, we have benefits. You have to invest. On our side, we win this. Why? Because yes, we do have the means, but the resources are not unlimited. It's limited, and we are already investing, so we do not take refugees, also because we're helping them by investing in their countries. And with that, I will conclude my speech. Thank you.
7 minutes and 55.
Then my speech will start in 3, 2, 1, panel. In my reply speech, 2 things. First of all, the clashes, showing you why the clashes were won by side opposition, and we get more impacts and benefits from this motion. Secondly, the comparative, and finally, the way, if time allows. Let's start with the first clash, which is responsibility. What does side proposition come up and tell us? They tell us that there are 2 types of responsibility that lead to moral obligation. Historic responsibility and the presence of resources that can be invested in this type of countries. How do we respond? We respond by telling you and explaining and breaking down the chain of mechanization that this historic responsibility has already been fulfilled. In 1,000 years, these countries cannot come up and tell us, oh, but 700 years ago you did this, then you have an historic responsibility, insofar as developed countries have taken the matter into their hands and have acted to solve the problem, then they have fulfilled that historic responsibility. When it comes to responsibility because of the presence of resources, we tell you that they can keep on helping them, but they don't have to host them. We asked side proposition several times in POIs and through rebuttals, why hosting specifically? But we get, unfortunately, no response other than because of historic precedent. We tell you that insofar as we have already fulfilled our historic responsibility, we can choose how to invest our money, and we give you a comparative on why the moral obligation when you have resources can be fulfilled by investing and by providing humanitarian aid and help to those people and to those climate refugees in other ways other than hosting them in your country. But then we tell you then why we shouldn't host them, because this is the step we take it further on side opposition. We tell you that we shouldn't host them because, one, it hurts rural communities and local economies, and therefore it hurts the people that are most sensitive in the side opposition and in developed countries. But then B, we tell you that we shouldn't do it because it doesn't benefit climate refugees, because it hurts them. And this leads us to our second clash, which is practical impacts. Now mind you that this clash is specifically important, even though the motion doesn't talk about practical impacts, because the goal, and both sides agree on this, is to help climate refugees, right? So this clash should be just as important as the first one. What does side proposition tell us? They tell us that climate refugees help the economy because they're able to boost it, and then, even if they're not able to help the economy, it is better than death, right? What do we tell you? We tell you that A, they don't help the economy. We mechanize it in two different ways, the loss of jobs because of illegal contracts and the lower wages because of demand and supply principle. And we tell you that even if it does help the economy, it is bad because it is exploitative, because it is done in a manner that deprives them of the rights of humans. It is done in a manner that keeps them stuck in a cycle. And what do they tell us to this? They tell us, well, it's still better than death. Is it? We don't agree with this, because A, there are still people dying on our side, but then B, because we provide you with a comparative, right? We tell you, maybe you would be right. It would be better than death if we didn't provide you with a comparative. But insofar as we provide you with a comparative that is able to solve those issues and to not get these people stuck in the cycles of exploitation, and we're able to save them, you should vote for side opposition. Let me remind you what our comparative is. We tell you that there is a limited amount of funds and resources, and therefore we should be really careful in how we choose to invest them. We choose to invest them in humanitarian aid so that we can provide them directly with humanitarian aid in the country they are living in building infrastructures that are able to face and bear the consequences of climate change, and then C, in emergencies we are able to build refugee centers in neighboring countries. We tell you, and this went unresponded by side proposition, that on their side they also have less incentives to even invest in climate research and in climate change mitigation, and that only leads to more climate refugees coming to developed nations. That is not sustainable in the long term. Vote for side opposition.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Once again, without me to everyone in this room, we must thank the opposition team for the great arguments that they brought upon us that are surely being enlightened. First of all, I would like to start by talking a little bit about the clash points that have been brought forward in this debate. We talked about the future for the refugees. They stated that it would be caught in a circle, exploited and oppressed. On the other side, us as the proposition team stated that they should be included in a country, they should help, they should be provided security. On the other side, they stated that we did not price the solution, and this was one of the biggest clash points. They stated that the solution would be to host them in neighboring countries or in refugees or in camp for refugees, but that they are already overflowing. Us, as the proposition of the proposition team, on the other side, we suggested to take up those refugees and to host them. They ask us numerous times why we should host. First of all, hosting is the fastest way to help them because we would able to help them immediately and not have to wait for the consequences of our action, such as investing. Then there is also the fact that they stated that numerous times that refugees do not help the economy, but that's simply untrue. Let's think about all those refugees that are not exploited because we do not condone exploitation and the government should not because it's against human rights. That those refugees fill up the gaps in the workforce in many countries, like think about Japan or Germany itself, where many skilled refugees try to help their society. One of the other biggest clash points was more centrally related to responsibility and if the moral obligation has been fulfilled or not. They stated that yes, the moral obligation has been fulfilled. And nowadays, the countries that are emitting the most emissions are the less developed countries, such as China and India and Indonesia itself. On the other side, as the proposition team stated that they have not yet fulfilled their moral obligation. First of all, there's the fact that yes, they had an historical fault to this matter, but there's also the fact that they are still benefiting from the emission produced by those less developed countries because they're more often than not moving their factories there to A, reduce the pollution produced by themselves as country, and B, to condemn what is called as exploitation, since in those factories, in those less developed countries, people are working overtime and for little wages. So, as a proposition team, we believe that hosting refugees is the best option if made by developed countries because they have the means, as the second speaker stated, to host them and to include in their society. As some countries like Australia, Germany has shown us, they have the means to thoroughly help them immediately and not help for the effects of a solution that will take over time, because there are people are dying now. They will be dying, yes, in 10 years, but we can save so many people if we hosted them. And then we stated that a moral obligation and something that should not be by guilt, but by the knowledge that we can do something. Developed countries can do something to help our people, because when we're talking about refugees, as we stated numerous times, we're not just talking about numbers. We're talking about people who need help of developed countries. And as the proposition team, truly believe that developed countries have a moral obligation to help them and save them. With this, my speech is done.
Thank you very much. The speech was 3 minutes and 39 seconds. So, thank you very much for team. We can talk about friends.